The judge was reading through my parents' demand for my entire inheritance when I stood up and placed a single sheet of paper on his desk. My mother's lawyer had just finished explaining why I deserved nothing from my grandmother's estate, how I was an ungrateful daughter who had abandoned the family, how I'd refused to care for my aging relatives, how I'd chosen my career over family obligations. My father sat in the front row nodding along, wearing the same black suit he'd worn to Grandma's funeral, and my mother dabbed her eyes with tissues like she was the victim in all of this. "Your Honor," I said, my voice steadier than I felt, "there's something the court needs to see before making any decisions about my character or my relationship with my grandmother." The bailiff took the paper from my hands, and I watched the judge's expression change as he read the first few lines, his eyebrows lifting, then his mouth falling open slightly. Within 30 seconds, he was reaching for his phone, and within 2 minutes, there were police officers walking through the courtroom doors. My parents' faces went white as they realized that their perfect victim story was about to collapse in the most public way possible. My name is Zara Mikhail, and I used to believe that family meant unconditional love. Before that courtroom destroyed every illusion I had left, I lived in a small apartment above a bakery in Portland's Pearl District, where the smell of fresh bread mixed with coffee from the shop next door created this warm, lived-in feeling that I'd never had growing up. Every morning, I'd sit at my kitchen table grading papers from my 5th grade students, circling spelling mistakes and writing encouraging notes in the margins of math assignments. Teaching wasn't glamorous work, but it filled something in me that had been empty for years. Kids are honest in ways that adults forget how to be. They'll tell you when they're confused, when something hurts, when they need help. They don't hide behind politeness or family expectations or the kind of manipulation that makes you question your own memory. When 8-year-old Marcus finally mastered long division after weeks of struggle, his smile was worth more than any performance review or salary increase. My apartment was small, but mine a studio with tall windows that caught the afternoon light and bookshelves I'd built myself from reclaimed wood. I had a reading chair by the window where I'd curl up on Sunday mornings with coffee and lesson plans, listening to the sounds of the neighborhood waking up. Street vendors setting up their stands, dog walkers chatting on the sidewalk, the distant hum of traffic on the bridges that connected this part of the city to everywhere else. But the most important space in my life was room 204 at Riverside Elementary, where 26 desks were arranged in groups of 4, and every wall was covered with student artwork and motivational posters. I'd been there for 7 years, long enough to see some of my former students graduate high school and start college. They'd stop by sometimes to update me on their lives, and those conversations reminded me why I'd chosen this profession despite my parents' constant criticism about wasting my education on other people's children. I kept a photo on my desk, not of my parents or family gatherings, but of my grandmother and me at my college graduation. She was tiny next to me in her navy dress, but her grip on my arm was strong, and her smile was proud in a way that my parents' smiles never were. She'd driven 4 hours by herself to watch me walk across that stage, and afterwards she told me that teaching was the most important job in the world because it gave people the tools to build better lives. If this story feels familiar, make sure you're subscribed. Some truths need to be told more than once. The first time I realized my parents saw me as a disappointment rather than a daughter, I was 12 years old. We were at my cousin Jennifer's piano recital, and she'd just finished playing some complicated piece by Chopin while I sat in the audience wearing my hand-me-down dress and cheap shoes from Payless. During the reception afterward, I overheard my mother talking to her sister about how lucky she was to have such a talented daughter, someone who would make the family proud. Then she glanced at me and sighed, saying that not all children were blessed with special gifts. The second betrayal happened when I was 16 and decided to apply for a teaching scholarship at Portland State. I'd been tutoring younger kids for 2 years, and I loved watching their faces light up when difficult concepts finally clicked. But when I showed my parents the scholarship application, my father laughed and said teaching was what people did when they couldn't succeed at real careers. My mother added that I should focus on finding a husband who could provide for me instead of wasting time on impossible dreams. But the worst betrayal was the most recent one, and it happened 3 months after my grandmother's funeral. I'd been her primary caregiver for the last 2 years of her life, driving to her house every weekend to help with groceries, medications, and doctor's appointments. My parents lived 20 minutes away but rarely visited, always too busy with their social obligations and church activities. When Grandma was hospitalized with pneumonia, I took unpaid leave from school to stay with her, sleeping in an uncomfortable chair beside her bed and advocating with nurses and doctors when her pain medication wasn't working. She died on a Tuesday morning in March, holding my hand and telling me how proud she was of the woman I'd become. The funeral was small, mostly neighbors and friends from her church, along with a few distant relatives who hadn't spoken to her in years. My parents organized everything, presenting themselves as devoted children who were devastated by their loss. They gave touching eulogies about family values and generational wisdom while I sat in the front row knowing that neither of them had spent more than an hour alone with her in the past 5 years. 2 weeks after the funeral, I received a letter from their attorney informing me that my parents were contesting Grandma's will. They claimed that I had manipulated her during her illness, that I had isolated her from her family and coerced her into leaving me her house and savings. The letter described me as a predatory relative who had taken advantage of an elderly woman's vulnerability for financial gain. Reading those words felt like being slapped by strangers who happened to share my DNA. The house they were fighting for was a modest 2-bedroom bungalow in southeast Portland, probably worth $400,000 in the current market. The savings account held about $180,000, money my grandmother had accumulated through decades of careful budgeting and smart investments. It wasn't a fortune, but it represented security and independence, two things I'd never had growing up in their house. More than that, it represented her belief in me, her confidence that I would use these resources to build something meaningful rather than just spend them on status symbols or social climbing. The court hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning in November, in one of those sterile government buildings where fluorescent lights buzz constantly and the air smells like disinfectant and defeat. I arrived 30 minutes early, carrying a folder containing copies of my grandmother's medical records, bank statements, and handwritten notes she'd made about her estate planning decisions. I wore my best teaching outfit, a navy blazer and gray slacks that made me look professional, but not expensive, approachable but not weak. My parents arrived with their lawyer, a sharp-dressed woman named Catherine Mills who specialized in estate litigation and had a reputation for aggressive tactics. They sat in the front row on the opposite side of the courtroom, whispering to each other and occasionally glancing in my direction with expressions I couldn't quite read. My mother wore her funeral dress, the same black outfit she'd worn to bury the woman whose memory she was now trying to destroy for money. When the hearing began, Catherine Mills painted a picture of me that was both familiar and completely false. According to her presentation, I was a manipulative daughter who had abandoned my family responsibilities until it became financially advantageous to reconnect. She claimed that I had deliberately isolated my grandmother from her son and daughter-in-law, filling her head with lies about their neglect and indifference. She suggested that my weekend visits were actually elaborate manipulation sessions designed to secure a larger inheritance. The most painful part was listening to my parents testify about their relationship with my grandmother. My father described weekly phone calls that I knew had never happened, claiming that he and my grandmother had discussed her concerns about my behavior and my attempts to control her medical care. My mother cried while explaining how I had prevented her from spending time with her dying mother-in-law, how I had refused to include them in important medical decisions, and had made them feel unwelcome in their own family. Every word was a lie, but they delivered their testimony with such conviction that I started to doubt my own memories. Had I been too protective of my grandmother's time and energy? Had I misinterpreted their absence as indifference when it was actually respect for boundaries I had drawn too strictly? The courtroom felt like it was shrinking around me, and I could feel sweat gathering at the base of my neck despite the air conditioning. When it was my turn to testify, I tried to tell the truth about those 2 years of caregiving, the medication schedules, the physical therapy appointments, the late-night trips to the emergency room when her breathing became labored. I explained how my grandmother had specifically asked me to handle her affairs because she trusted my judgment and appreciated my attention to detail. But my words felt weak against their polished presentation, and I could see skepticism in the judge's eyes. That's when Catherine Mills delivered her closing argument, demanding that my parents receive the entire estate because they were the rightful heirs who had been manipulated out of their inheritance by a daughter who had never learned proper family values. She requested that I be investigated for elder abuse and fraud, suggesting that criminal charges might be appropriate given the severity of my alleged manipulation. The judge was nodding along, his pen moving across his notepad as he wrote what I assumed were the legal justifications for ruling against me. The room felt like it was spinning, and I realized that I was about to lose not just my inheritance, but potentially my reputation and career. That's when I remembered the envelope my grandmother had given me 6 months before she died, the one she'd made me promise to keep safe, but never open unless someone tried to hurt her memory. I sat in my car in the courthouse parking lot after that first hearing, staring at my grandmother's house key on my keychain and feeling like everything solid in my life was crumbling. The judge had scheduled a continuation for the following week, giving both sides time to present additional evidence. My court-appointed lawyer had basically told me to prepare for the worst. My parents' testimony was compelling, their legal representation was expensive and experienced, and estate contests usually favored biological children over grandchildren regardless of the actual facts. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying my mother's testimony, the way she dabbed her eyes while describing how I'd stolen her final months with her mother-in-law. The worst part was that a small part of me wondered if they were right. Maybe I had been too protective, too quick to assume they didn't care. Maybe I had misread the situation and my grandmother's preferences. But then I remembered the conversation we'd had about the envelope. It was a Saturday afternoon in September, and I was helping her organize her medication schedule when she suddenly got very serious. She told me there were people who might try to rewrite history after she was gone, people who would claim to love her while fighting over what she'd left behind. She said she'd prepared something that would protect the truth, but she hoped it would never be necessary to use it. She made me promise that if anyone ever questioned her mental state or suggested that I had manipulated her decisions, I would open the envelope and share its contents with whoever needed to see them. At the time, I thought she was being overly cautious. My parents had their flaws, but surely they wouldn't stoop to lies and manipulation over money. How naive I'd been. I went to her house that night, using my key to let myself into the quiet rooms where we'd spent so many weekends together. The envelope was exactly where she'd told me it would be, tucked inside her jewelry box between old photographs and her mother's wedding ring. My hands were shaking as I opened it, not sure what I'd find, but hoping it would be enough to counter my parents' well-rehearsed lies. Inside were 17 pages that changed everything I thought I knew about my family. The documents in that envelope were photocopies of bank statements, medical records, and handwritten notes that painted a picture of my parents' relationship with my grandmother that was far darker than I'd imagined. There were records of them asking her for money repeatedly over the past 5 years, $3,000 for car repairs, $8,000 for a vacation to Europe, $12,000 for home renovations that they claimed were necessary, but were actually cosmetic upgrades. Each request came with promises to pay her back that were never fulfilled. But the most damning evidence was a series of voicemails my grandmother had saved on an old answering machine, transcribed in her careful handwriting. In these messages, my parents berated her for being selfish with her money, accused her of favoring me over their family, and threatened to cut off contact if she didn't help them with their financial problems. One particularly cruel message from my mother suggested that my grandmother was becoming senile and needed professional care, implying that they would have her declared incompetent if she didn't cooperate. My first instinct was to rush back to court immediately and present this evidence, but my lawyer advised caution. He explained that introducing new evidence required proper procedures, and that my parents' attorney would have time to respond and potentially discredit the documents. We needed to be strategic about timing and presentation to maximize the impact. I spent the weekend making copies and organizing the materials into a coherent narrative. I created a timeline showing how my parents' financial requests had escalated as my grandmother's health declined, and how their threats had intensified after she stopped giving them money. I cross-referenced their court testimony with the documented evidence of their actual behavior, highlighting every contradiction and outright lie they'd told under oath. But my first attempt to use this evidence backfired. When I tried to present it during the next hearing, Catherine Mills objected on procedural grounds, arguing that the documents hadn't been properly authenticated and that introducing them now was prejudicial to her clients. The judge agreed to review the materials privately but warned that he might not allow them as evidence if they didn't meet legal standards. I left that hearing feeling defeated again. I had proof of my parents' lies and manipulation, but the legal system seemed designed to protect their right to lie as long as they did it properly. My lawyer tried to reassure me that truth eventually prevails in court, but I could see doubt in his eyes. Estate contests were messy, emotional affairs where family dysfunction often mattered less than legal technicalities. That night, I called my grandmother's former neighbor, Mrs. Chin, who had witnessed many of the interactions between my parents and my grandmother. She confirmed that she'd seen them arguing on several occasions and that my grandmother had confided her concerns about their constant requests for money. But when I asked if she'd be willing to testify, she hesitated. She was elderly herself, and the thought of being cross-examined by aggressive lawyers terrified her. I realized that having evidence and being able to use it effectively were two completely different challenges. My parents had prepared for this legal battle carefully, crafting a narrative that was difficult to disprove even when it was completely false. I needed something more than documentation. I needed something that would expose their lies so dramatically that no legal maneuvering could hide the truth. The breakthrough came when I was reviewing the voicemail transcriptions for the third time, trying to find something I'd missed. One of the messages my mother had left included a specific threat that made my blood run cold. If you don't help us with the down payment for the new house, we'll have to tell everyone about your memory problems and have you evaluated for competency. The date on this message was significant. It was from 2 months before my grandmother updated her will to leave everything to me. But more importantly, my mother had mentioned a new house. As far as I knew, my parents still lived in the same house they'd owned for 15 years. I decided to do some investigating, and what I found was a paper trail that revealed the real reason they were so desperate for my grandmother's money. They had purchased a second home in Bend, Oregon, using my grandmother's money as a down payment without ever intending to repay her. The house was worth $750,000, far beyond what their legitimate income could support. They'd lied to the mortgage lender about the source of their down payment, claiming it was from their savings rather than borrowed money from a relative. This wasn't just family greed, it was mortgage fraud, a federal crime that carried serious penalties. I brought this information to my lawyer, who immediately understood its significance. My parents hadn't just lied about their relationship with my grandmother, they'd committed a felony using her money, and then tried to steal the rest of her estate to cover their tracks. We had them on bank fraud, mortgage fraud, and perjury for their testimony in court. The final hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in December. This time, I felt different walking into that courthouse. I wasn't the confused, hurt granddaughter trying to defend her character against family accusations. I was someone who had uncovered a criminal conspiracy and was about to expose it in the most public way possible. My parents arrived looking confident, probably assuming that they'd successfully painted me as a manipulative caregiver who had stolen their rightful inheritance. Catherine Mills had prepared another emotional presentation about family values and the sanctity of parent-child relationships. They had no idea what was waiting for them. When the judge called for any final evidence, I stood up and approached the bench with a single sheet of paper. It was a copy of the mortgage application for their Bend house, showing my grandmother's money listed as their personal savings. But attached to it was a bank transfer record proving that the money had come directly from her account just 2 days before their down payment was due. The judge read the document twice, then looked up at my parents with an expression I'll never forget. He asked Catherine Mills if she was aware that her clients had used fraudulent information on a federal mortgage application. The color drained from her face as she realized what she was looking at. Then he did something I hadn't expected. He called for a recess and contacted the district attorney's office. Within minutes, there were police officers in the courtroom, and my parents were being read their rights for bank fraud and perjury. My mother started crying, but this time her tears were real, not performed for sympathy. The criminal charges against my parents made local news, which was both satisfying and strange. Seeing their mugshots in the Oregonian with headlines about mortgage fraud felt surreal. These were people who had spent my entire childhood lecturing me about integrity and moral behavior. The irony wasn't lost on me, but it also wasn't as sweet as I'd expected it to be. My grandmother's estate was settled within 2 months. The judge ruled that my parents' criminal behavior disqualified them from any inheritance, and that their testimony had been so thoroughly discredited that there was no basis for questioning my grandmother's final wishes. I inherited the house and savings exactly as she had intended, along with a letter of apology from the court for the delays and difficulties I'd endured. Moving into my grandmother's house felt like coming home to a place I'd never lived. Her furniture was still arranged the way she'd liked it, and her books were still organized by author on the built-in shelves. I kept most of her belongings, not out of sentimentality, but because they reminded me of weekend afternoons when we'd sit together reading different books in comfortable silence. The extra bedrooms gave me space to create a home office where I could develop lesson plans and grade papers without feeling cramped. I turned her sewing room into a reading nook with comfortable chairs and good lighting, a place where I could decompress after difficult days at school. The garden she'd maintained so carefully became my new weekend project, and I discovered that working with soil and plants provided the same kind of meditative focus that teaching did. My parents were sentenced to 18 months in prison and ordered to pay restitution to the mortgage company. They lost their house in Bend and had to declare bankruptcy to cover their legal fees and fines. I felt no satisfaction in their punishment. It seemed like a natural consequence of choices they'd made, not a victory I'd won. The most unexpected change was in my relationship with my students and their families. Word had somehow gotten around that I'd been through a difficult family situation, and several parents made a point of telling me how much they appreciated my dedication to their children. One mother said that seeing how I handled adversity made her trust me even more with her son's education, that she could see I was someone who stood up for what was right even when it was difficult. 6 months later, I was sitting in my grandmother's garden on a Sunday morning, drinking coffee and watching the roses she'd planted bloom for the first time under my care. I thought about how different my life looked now compared to that terrible day in court when I'd felt like everything was falling apart. The house around me was quiet and peaceful, filled with the kind of contentment that comes from knowing you're exactly where you belong. I realized that my parents had given me an unexpected gift, though it wasn't one they'd intended. By forcing me to defend my grandmother's memory and my own integrity, they'd helped me discover a strength I didn't know I possessed. I'd learned that truth doesn't always speak loudly, but it has a way of making itself heard when it matters most. The money from my grandmother's estate gave me security, but the real inheritance was something more valuable: the knowledge that some people will try to rewrite history to serve their own purposes, and that standing up to them isn't just about winning or losing. It's about protecting the memory of people who trusted you with their truth. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd never opened that envelope, if I'd accepted their version of events and walked away from what my grandmother had left me. But then I remember that she knew exactly what kind of people her son and daughter-in-law were, and she'd prepared me to face them with weapons they never saw coming. The best revenge isn't always getting what you deserve. Sometimes it's just making sure the truth gets told, no matter how uncomfortable it makes people who prefer their lies.